thing. There we go. So, I am so excited to be sitting with you here on this stage because Orwell has kind of obsessed my life for 7 years. And only you dwarf that degree of obsession. Because Orwell, from what you wrote in both of your biographies here, you were like in your teens and you were writing your O-levels and you got the question, who would you most like to write a biography about? Was the answer Orwell?
It was, yes. Age 15.
Age 15.
Although I seem to recall in that, for those of you not recognised in the English school system, O-levels are what you do at 15, 16 to procure your passage into school sixth form. So is that kind of like high school?
We don't really have it. Like, it's kind of like an SAT essay question or something.
But I did make the point in that, answering that exam, that he had said in his will that no biography should be written. So there was prescience in this. I mean, it took me another 27 years to write a book about him, but there was prescience in that.
Right, so basically you've been wanting to write a biography of Orwell, and you've done it, but since you were 15. So we're talking like 50 years, give or take.
Well, I don't know whether it was quite so sort of blatant and considered as that, but I can remember consciously, all through my 20s, certainly, if I came upon a piece of Orwell intelligence, or if I came upon a person, and when I started hacking around in the London literary world, well, a very long time ago now, if I came across some celebrated old stager, I would go up to them and say, "Excuse me, Mr. Soto, but did you know George Orwell back in the 1940s?" And sometimes they would say yes, and that would be fascinating.
So what drew you to him? Because I think you read a book of his, like most of you here, I had only read 1984 and Animal Farm, and I had read Burmese Days, but it was a clergyman's daughter that drew you to him when you were a teenager. So what were you getting out of that? And want to tell them a bit about the book?
This is weird because, as I'm sure everybody in this audience knows, it's a trick of the light actually. I can't actually see you. I can see only blackness, but I'm sure you're all there. I can hear you laughing. Could I say, by the way, how great it is to be in Narrowsburg, where my wife and I have never been before. It's clearly a beacon of culture. I mean, I'm told there's well over 100 of you here. I went 10 nights ago, I did an event at Balliol College, Oxford, and 12 people turned up. So I can say that Narrowsburg leads, Oxford trails desultorily behind. But to go back to your question, Liesl, people come to books in very odd ways. People come to writers in very odd ways. People have very odd ideas about books and the people who wrote them. It doesn't conform to any pattern or sort of set of protocols. And my parents, when I was young, my parents weren't remotely bookish people. My father and my mother both had a shelf of books, which I think is very common in English households at that point. And some impetus unknown to me had led my mother to buy, I think 1961 was the date, a copy of A Clergyman's Daughter, which is Orwell's second novel, and even experienced Orwell fanciers would probably concede that it's not the greatest novel in the park, that he ever wrote. And it's about a woman living in a Suffolk town in the 1930s who loses her memory and goes off on a tramping expedition to the Kentish hop fields, and then spends the night in Trafalgar Square, and then ends up working in a terrible private school in West London. And I know as a biographer that it's Orwell simply feeding a lot of his own life.
It was amazing, because he writes down and out in Paris and London. He goes out tramping around with bums in London, cadging on the streets, sleeping on park benches, pulling hops fields, and then he sends this prim little British girl who's running away from her mean
that's right.
And she goes and works in the hop field. I mean,
And it's his life. But for some reason, you see, the point I make about this book is that for some reason, although it was so utterly removed from my own particular circumstances, written 40 years before I was reading it, about a social coin of vantage that I had no particular knowledge of. And yet, in this curious, ineluctable way, that book spoke to me, and it communicated to me. It was the first sort of grown-up book I'd written, but before that, I just confined myself to talking, which is fantastic, but Orwell was something more. And what I always, I can say this to you in confidence because I know that nobody in this audience has ever heard me speak at a literary, I'm pretty sure that no one in this audience has heard me speak at a literary festival before. But what I always say is that the sensation is identical to the one that Orwell defined when he first read Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer in 1935. And Orwell very much liked Miller. I think he was one of his favourite American novelists. And he thought he had a very realistic view of the world, which he appreciated. And he said of Miller's novel, he said that, he wrote this for me. He knows all about me. And it was the sensation, I think, which I had with A Clergyman's Daughter, that there was only one copy in the world. And mysteriously it had turned up on my mother's bookshelf and I had read it. It was a bullet winging back across time to me, saying, and it said the immediacy of the writing, and the directness and the not being afraid to say sometimes quite savage things and savage things about people. And like his third novel, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, which we were talking about before we came on stage. And there's a kind of end of tether quality. It's a humorous in some ways, but it's not the work of a happy or a comfortable man.
No, well, he reminds you almost of a brilliant child having a tantrum. He's furious, and there's something cathartic or unusual about it. If you read 1984, you get the same kind of explosion of rage that almost goes back to its sort of childish phase.
Well, shall we just talk briefly about where he came from, what he's doing, where
I want
his
you
position him?
I'm going to ask you to read a section from your book, but so you wrote this first biography of him in 2003, and now you've done a sequel. Not a lot of people get sequel biographies.
No, it's a very unusual thing to do. There is, as far as I know, there is a solitary precedent, which is the biographer Michael Holroyd, who wrote a groundbreaking, pioneering book about the Bloomsbury literary figure, Lytton Strachey in the late 1960s, and then it was huge. Two massive volumes, two wrist-distending volumes. If you pick them up in either hand, and then he wrote another one-volume Life of Strachey 25 years later. So I thought, well, if Michael Holroyd, whom I very much respect, in some ways the doyen of English literary biography, if he can do that, well, then I can have a go as well. One of the things that I've tried to do in this, in both books, but particularly in this second book, and I think what people always want to know about literary figures, in my case the literary heroes, is, what are they like? It's in some ways it's a cliche question because paradoxically one of the things I think about this book is how difficult it is to know him. But I was just going to read a paragraph. I'm afraid this is a massive great tome, it's 600 pages long. My editor in England paid me the great compliment of saying that it doesn't read like a long book, David, which is a relief because it's any. So, but there's an interlude in the middle where the narrative kind of stops at an appropriate point, and there's a longish chapter called Orwell and His World, and I just wanted to sort of break the ice about his exceptionally peculiar character, I think it's fair to say, by just reading you the first paragraph of this. So this is Orwell and His World. And in fact, it starts with a quote from a piece that he wrote about Henry Miller, where he says, a writer's work is not something he takes out of his brain like tins of soup out of a storeroom. He has to create it day by day out of his contact with people and things. So, some basic behavioural questions. What was Orwell like? How did he seem? If you were in a room with him, how might he conduct himself and what would you talk about? One of the fascinations of the countless memorials to Orwell in action is how often the same adjectives recur. Thin, gaunt, pale, for example, closely followed by emaciated, and oddly enough, Gothic, as if the subject had stepped out of a Dürer etching or a late medieval frieze. Like a figure on the front of Chartres Cathedral, a BBC colleague suggested. By early middle age, all traces of youthful exuberance had vanished. Terribly old, terribly dry, Lucian Freud remembered of meeting him for the first time. Orwell would then have been in his middle 40s. Posterity frequently goes to town on Orwell's saint-like qualities, But even contemporary onlookers took note of a curiously sanctified air. The normally unimpressionable Eileen, watching her husband lean over to comfort a terrified woman who'd taken cover in the Langford Court stairwell as the bombs rained on St John's Wood during the Blitz, thought him like Christ. So that's a kind of idea of what people thought about him, but it was such an odd, such a short, such a truncated, such a myth-laden life. I mean, he only lived 46 years, born 1903, died in early January 1950.
And also 1984 only came out at the end of 49.
Exactly. So, this is the great trend. He spends 20 years, I mean, his writing career doesn't get going until the 1930s, by which time he served in the Burma police force as a servant of the British Imperial Raj. He spent ages establishing himself as a writer. He spent about 15 years really not being very successful. He writes Animal Farm in 1945, that extraordinary satire of the Soviet Revolution. And he's dead 4.5 years later.
He's dead, but he's also got married for the second time on his deathbed, weeks before he dies. And you've got Malcolm Muggeridge there and David Astor. But if we could just back up a little bit, one of the fun things about this book is, yes, we know about Animal Farm, we know about 1984, but you introduced us to him as a 2-year-old whose mother says, Eric has got a cold again, and he's been saying everything is beastly.
Well,
and so he's like 2 years old, and he's already disgruntled.
Well, it's a key Orwell adjective. It's amazing how often he called things beastly throughout his life. It's an Edwardian word in the context of British. It's like saying something is frightful, frightfully. And it's also, there's a kind of slightly upper class way of talking, of which that is perfectly redolent. But no, so as you say, it's the end of his life. Everything comes very quickly in a rush at the end. The best-selling novel that's picked up on both sides of the Atlantic that sells hundreds of thousands of copies here in America, far more than back home. And he's dead. There's tragic scenes in his, the last 6 months of his life where he's lying on his deathbed at University College Hospital in London, and there are the first signs, of a fortune coming in from this book. And he would sit there and say to his friends, "It's fairy gold. I've made all this money, and now I'm going to die." He would say. He was quite fatalistic about it. This again is one of the
And he also had just adopted a child. He had a 2-year-old.
He had
his son Richard.
And I advise strongly anybody who is here can come on Sunday morning to when Richard Blair, his surviving adopted son, is being beamed in by satellite or some piece of technological wizardry to have a conversation with me, because Richard is now in his 80th year. He was adopted by Orwell and his first wife Eileen in 1944. Eileen sadly died on the operating table a year later, and Orwell took the decision to bring Richard up himself, insofar as
he really cared about the boy. Your book humanizes this man. I thought him as a gaunt figure who goes to the Spanish Civil War, is shot in his throat, and But what you made me see is this strange boy who went actually to St. Cyprian's, a boarding school, and if anyone has not read Such Were the Joys, it's like this 30,000 word long tirade about the cruelty of adults, who are always watching you. You felt the roots of 1984 and his feeling of persecution, but at the same time, he loved that time. You'd say at one point that everyone says that his biggest rebellion is fighting against his actual nostalgia for his youth, and he went to Eton, where he loafed. But it's very interesting reading your book to understand how the child made the man, and his memory of his boyhood lingers on and on. What do you think about that?
I mean, the other thing too is that, I think it's not just writers, everybody in the world has what Orwell's great friend Anthony Powell, the English novelist, called a personal myth. Powell once said in one of his novels that what happens to a person in his or her life isn't important. It's what they think happened, or what they think other people think. It's the idea of the personal. If you can get your personal myth sorted, it doesn't matter what happens to you, because you can carry that banner triumphantly above your head as you move through life, and you'll be okay. And Orwell's personal myth is a very odd one, given how successful he was in his life, ultimately, because he believed he was a failure. He believed he was fatalistic too. I mean, at the end of his life, he remarked to friends that when he was seriously ill, I've had this coming to me all my life. In other words, the President of the Immortals, to use Thomas Hardy's favourite word, had got him in his sights from the moment he was born. And that the essay, Such Were the Joys, about the terrible time he purportedly had at this English prep school in the years during the Great War, that Liesl referred to, is fascinating because it ends. I mean, Orwell, when he was in his early teens, was probably the most brilliant classical scholar in England. He won scholarships at the top English public schools, and yet the end of that essay, to which you referred, ends with Orwell leaving St Cyprian saying, failure. I have failed here, failure. All that lay ahead of me was failure. And you think, 13-year-old boy going off to Eton with a classic scholarship, you failed?
Yeah, no, but you could tell it felt sincere, or it felt that he was chippy, he had a chip on his shoulder. He was so aware of the other children having money, and this being Orwell, he all went on to Eton, and even though you always think of him as sort of kicking against the sort of siege social order, a lot of his friends have gone to Eton too. You had Cyril Connolly, who wrote Enemies of Promise, and also wrote about St. Cyprian's, and they were like, it wasn't all that bad.
Well, yes, but you see, there is. You go back again to what, Orwell's friend Anthony Powell, in one of his novels called The Question of Upbringing. Orwell's social antennae were highly developed, even from an early age. And I suppose people often say to me, Americans often say to me that, you English people, you have class, we have status. Now, I'm not always sure about that, but Orwell was certainly finely attuned to nuances of class, and he wants to find his background. This may sound absurdly esoteric to a transatlantic audience, but he described his background as belonging to the lower upper middle class. Now, I can tell you, as someone who would say that he came from the upper lower middle class, I can say that I know exactly what he's talking about. But what he meant by that, you see, was that his how he extrapolated this for the purposes of his life was that it meant that all his expertise was theoretical rather than practical. So theoretically, he was a what we in England would call a posh boy, but in fact his father was a very middle-ranking Anglo-Indian civil servant with not very much money, and so theoretically, his baptismal name was not George Orwell; it was Eric Arthur Blair, which he detested and changed when he became a writer in the early 1930s. And Orwell said that. Orwell always said that the expertise was theoretical. So in other words, the Blairs should have been the kind of person. I mean, Orwell's great-great-grandfather was an earl. That's aristocratic. But the money had gone by the time he was born in 1903. So although theoretically the Blairs were the kind of people who hunted and shot and had servants, they didn't really have enough money for any of that. So they never hunted or shot or dressed for dinner. And they had one lady who came in, to do the dishes once a day. So it was all. When he went to Eton, he was very conscious of the fact, I think, that especially too at the pressure, there were always people with far more money than he had, whose passage through life was immediately kind of. Whereas he went off and served in the Burma Police at the age of 19, and was trying to forge a career working for the British Raj.
It's just amazing. He went off to Burma in 22? So he was. Can you not hear me?
You turned it off.
It's on. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
No.
I can hear my. Yeah, I'm doing good. What's happening?
Is it working?
It's not. No, I can hear from here.
Can you make it work?
There's a backup.
Okay, good. Can you hear me?
It's good. It's
I'm
good.
sorry for the socks and sandals. I'm not German. I'm just cold.
I think it's really hot here, but then I come from England.
Yeah, might as well come from a bucket of ice cubes. So one thing that we were just talking about. Were we talking about Eton?
We're talking about he's going to Burma at the age of 19 in
That's
1922.
Right. Yeah, he was only 19 years old, and I Burmese days rings to me like Somerset Maugham or something. But it's beautiful. But it's also something. I wonder. We all react so strongly, positively to 1984 or in terror. But how are his books doing lately that are that have attitudes that today are uncomfortable? Burmese days, I think, was uncomfortable for Gallants. Did he publish it through Gallants or through Second Warburg? Because they were afraid that people would sue him, whose names are mentioned. Now the sensibilities are different. And he also had problems, 1984, he couldn't publish that with, I meant Animal Farm, with Gollancz, because it was perceived as being anti-Russia. Well, back in 1940s, Russia was fighting the Nazis, and a lot of the red socialists in England sort of thought Russia was a hero, so they were.
Well, it wasn't just the red socialists; it was the right-wing conservatives too. And I seem to remember, is there not a Southern American folk song from the 1940s called "Stalin Wasn't Stalling"? Stalin wasn't stalling when he beat the Beast of Berlin, I believe, by some close harmony trio from Tennessee or something. No, anybody know this one? No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing is, though,
but I mean, it's his sensitivities that were political then that he had to be gaming.
Yeah, I mean,
now
you wouldn't possibly. This seems scarcely credible here, in the 21st century. But Orwell wrote the manuscript of Animal Farm, which is a satire of the Soviet Revolution, a very closely wrought one, with every principal event given its due in this 30,000-word book.
Through allegory.
And through allegory. It was finished in the early part of 1944, and Orwell had terrific difficulty in getting it published because it was so obviously anti-Stalin and and sort of showing how the revolution, to Orwell's mind, had been corrupted. And publisher after publisher turned it down. And the reason, one of this shows actually Orwell's humorous objective side, but the reason that one publisher gave for turning it down was, quote, Stalin wouldn't like it.
I mean, you can't believe it. Cancel culture in the 1940s.
But it gets worse, you see. So there's an account in the diary of Orwell's friend, Liesl Holden, where Orwell said, they've turned down my book on the grounds that Stalin wouldn't like it. And then he said, can you imagine Joe Stalin, who doesn't understand a word of any non-Russian language, sitting in the Kremlin with a copy of Animal Farm saying, I don't like this. But what is really, the thing that you will find scarcely credible is that the publisher, Jonathan Cape, had been advised not to publish that book by an official at the Ministry of Information in the Second World War, whose name, who was a Russian spy, it was later turned out. So that was, Peter Smollett. Peter Smollett, his name was, and he was later unmasked as a Russian spy. So that's the degree of influence that the Soviet Union had on British publishing.
We just can't understand that today, what was going on, in the cultural and intellectual world. I mean, basically, Orwell was in a weird situation. Now, you make it so clear in this book that he came upon his political attitude towards socialism in Spain. He hadn't really been exactly sure what his politics were. And how did you find out so much more in this book than in the first?
I suppose I ought to, what I really ought to... There's so much. What a compliment. Yeah, in some ways this is a bit of cheek, a bit of effrontery, writing a 600-page book about somebody of whom you previously wrote a 450, you have a copy, a 450-page
I have underlined the book.
But essentially there are three reasons for doing this. Well, actually there's a fourth. The fourth reason is my complete obsession and, love of this extraordinary writer whom I, were it possible, I would probably try and sit down and write a third book, if anything. But the reasons, there are three reasons essentially for this act of literary bravado. And one of them is, as Liesl acknowledged, the huge amount of new material that came up, mostly to do with women that he'd known in the 1930s.
I almost think you should subtitle this Orwell, The Women.
Orwell, The Women.
Because Inez Holden, he pounced. I didn't think of sickly Orwell as a pouncer, but he's like, in all of their letters, that's what he was up to.
He was, but you see,
and he was
he had the most curious psychological underpinning. And so the basis, a lot of these new letters, there's a particular woman called Eleanor Jakes that he knew in Suffolk in the 1930s who turned him down. He wanted to marry her, but she turned him down on the grounds that her daughter told me once that he was either too cynical or too sardonic. So that's a warning, you guys out there. The cynicism and the sardonicism, they just don't work. But the thing about Eleanor is that she decided that he would marry his best friend when they lived in Southwold in the 1930s, a man called Dennis Collings. And yet, even when they're engaged, Orwell is writing Eleanor these, what to me are really curious letters, trying to set up assignations, kind of, we could meet such and such, and and I'm thinking to myself, what's he doing? Because did she encourage him? I don't think so. I think there's a kind of delusional quality to them. I think he's kind of imagining a relationship that by that point scarcely existed. So there's that aspect. The second
But that's
reason,
some of the new things you found. Susanna Collins found a trove of letters from her mother.
oh God, yes,
From
it literally did happen that when Eleanor's daughter died, they were clearing the house and somebody, I mean, it sounds, it sounds as well as a kind of cliche biographical inquiry, but it really did happen that the man who was clearing the house went into the woodshed and found an old handbag covered with mouse droppings that he was about to throw out when he thought, well, I'll just have a look inside. And he pulled out this big buff envelope on which someone, I think Eleanor from the handwriting, had written, "Burn after my death." And she died in 1961, and this was in 2007. So for 46 years, somebody, we don't know who or for what reasons, had not followed those instructions, and here were these 19 love letters. But the second reason, I suppose, which, given that I've talked about Richard Blair and urged you to come and watch him being beamed in via Zoom on Father's Day to talk about his father. When I wrote the first book, which I started researching at the end of, just at the end of the last century, which makes everything sound very old and antiquated. But at that point, there were any number of elderly people still around, literary people who'd known him and written about him in their memoirs. Ordinary people who lived in, particularly lived in places like Southwold, who remembered him as a young man. And I was assiduous in going around to talking to them, and they're all dead. And here, 73 and a half years after his premature death, I can tell you that there are 7 people in the world left who knew Orwell. I mean, I'm not talking about small children who were in a room with him in 1946, but people who actually remember what he taught, what he spoke, how he spoke through the conversations they had. The number is 7. Richard is the youngest, he's 79, the eldest is 100. So when when that prospective next Orwell biographer comes along in however many years, there probably won't be anybody. So it's very important to corral these people and see what they had to say, even if, I came across in my hometown in Norwich, quite providentially and extraordinarily, I came across a 93-year-old man who remembered Orwell coming back for his father's funeral in Southwold in 1939. And, just to have that, what was he like? What was he, the memories of being a small child, of being, speaking to him, were just, but they're all going. They weren't, when I started writing the book, I think there were 10 or 11. Now there are 7. I mean, it's almost like, as I say, it's almost like the Lord of the Rings, the 7. Yeah. Well, this kind of, in fact, I gave a copy, the old gentleman in Norwich, I gave a copy to his son, or rather, I gave a copy to him, but I know his son, with whom I was at school, and I had an email from him the other morning. He said, "I'm looking forward to reading your book once one of the 7 has finished it."
Wait, but so those are 2 reasons. One, new sources, new letters. 2, people still alive. You said there were 2 other reasons that you wanted to write this book.
Well, the third reason is my obsession, but we'll put that to one side. But the fourth reason, of course, is that biography is never static. A biography is a snapshot. It's a particular sensibility coming up against another sensibility at a particular point in time, and that whatever prejudice and assumptions that you bring to life writing will be evident in that. And I was conscious that in those 20 years, a number of new, I suppose what one would call interpretive ways of looking at Orwell had arisen. I mean, it's perfectly possible to look at Orwell through the prism of the Black Lives Matter movement, because his great-grandfather made his money out of the slave trade. There wasn't any of it left.
That's
by
not
the time.
in the book, though.
Yes, it is. Yeah. First chapter. Yeah. It's in there. Well, no. I mean, there is a record of the Blair family plantations in Jamaica in the 1820s, and the names of the slaves and the indentured labourers. As I said, none of this money was left by the time. But there are terrible ironies evident in this, because I discovered that. In 1941, when during the war, Orwell worked for the BBC on their Eastern service for 2 or 3 years.
I love that chapter. I love that.
And in 1941, they decided they would have a centenary programme to mark the abolition of slavery in British dominions. Orwell played the slave owner. And you could not make it up. You've already alluded to the necessity to examine him under the glass of the Me Too movement, because I'm a nut, and I would defend him on almost any grounds about anything, but it has to be admitted, I think, that Orwell behaved badly to his first wife, Eileen, and he behaved badly to some of the women.
Well, but Eileen apparently May, it seems, have cavorted with George Copp in the Spanish Civil War.
Well,
Now, I know it can't be proved, but all of these people, I mean, he was constantly ill, in the hospital, bronchitis. They're both carrying on. They're moving house incessantly. How did he write the number of times they moved? And then,
well, he was driven.
There was
I mean,
he
was driven. I mean, he was never so happy as when putting words on paper. And I think it's true to say, I mean, you're quite right about the womenizing and the eye for the ladies and all this kind of thing. But when it came to it, his greatest commitment was to his work. And his wife, I mean, Eileen, however he behaved, she adored him. And you can see this in her letters, some of which are very sorrowful. I mean, she realizes the sacrifices that she's made. There's some of the letters she wrote just before she died are terrible in their self-abnegation. You know, she's up waiting to have this operation and nobody quite knows what's wrong with her. No one quite knows what the state of her uterus will be when someone goes in and has a look. And she says, she says in a letter to him, what really worries me is I don't think I'm worth the money. I the money for the operation. That is terrible. That is a terrifying thing. And Richard, this is the same letter in which Richard, aged 1, is sitting in his cradle, talking away as it's difficult to read those letters without weeping. But she was a very astute and humorous observer.
Yes.
There's a very, very funny letter written at the beginning of the Second World War, when Orwell's politics by this time were very radical. I mean, he wrote a pamphlet called The Lion and the Unicorn: Socialism and the English Genius, and it more or less says that what England needs to make herself, to promote social equality and economic prosperity is a revolution. And Orwell seriously thinks there's going to be a revolution. But Orwell was a small c conservative in every aspect of his life except politics. And so Eileen, who'd read this part of this manuscript and got wind of these, well, shall I call them equivocations, Eileen said to her friend, yes, George is writing this pamphlet about how to be a socialist while Tory.
Yeah.
So in other words, there are these two aspects of his makeup colliding head on in this pamphlet he writes in the early part of the Second World War.
I just love the personal context you give for so many of these essays and pamphlets and books of his that we just think of as novels. And you had this wonderful teasing line in your first volume where you talk about Orwell left no detailed account of his formative years, and vast areas of his personal life stretch out into impenetrable blackness. But I feel that you are finding in his novels the echoes of his life, but you've also
I
found
hope
information.
I was. You see, my theory, such as it is, about almost everybody who reads Orwell, who comes to him in the 21st century, indulges in to use a rather fancy word, in teleology. Now, teleology means you start with something and you work backwards to find out how it happened. So with Orwell, you look at the extraordinary success and readability and prescience. The extraordinary thing about it was how many of the things about the modern world he got right and its political arrangements. So you look at those two late novels and then you work backwards and you try and find things in his life that speed up the trajectory towards those two books. Now, my theory about all Orwell's 6 novels is they're all actually the same book. And so John Flory, who blows his brains out at the end of Burmese Days, is pretty much the same as Winston Smith in 1984. They're all oppressed solitaries on whom the world is ganging up. They're people pressed in and hemmed in by malign exterior forces, and they make a little kick against it. They have a small rebellion, like Animal Farm, the animals rebelling in that, and they're always repressed and brought back. And so Dorothy Hare, a clergyman's daughter, ends up exactly as she began in her father's rectory, making the costumes for the village fete.
And Gordon Comstock.
Gordon Comstock ends up, you see, Gordon Comstock, for those of you who haven't read the book, is this furiously angry young poet, completely at odds with the modern world, but he has this marvellous girlfriend called Rosemary who sustains him, and he's given up a really good job in advertising to work in a bookshop, and he hates the books, and he spends the first chapter just ranting against all these modern writers that he just loathes, and some ancient ones as well. And at the end of the book, when Rosemary is expecting a baby, what does he do? He announces that he'll marry her and go back to the advertising agency. So although the novel ends on this vaguely optimistic note, in fact, Gordon has cancelled out all the ambitions, albeit negative ambitions, that he had at the beginning. So he's gone back to serve the money god, whom he swore that he would never serve at the beginning of the book.
Right, but it's also, it reminds me so much of George Gissing, who is one of his favorite writers. I mean, we can't go on forever and ever, but it's so fun reading about his favorite authors. Like, I absolutely love Samuel Butler's The Way of All Flesh, which is all about oppressive parents making young men miserable. I remember a line in that book, no man is allowed to blame his
Gissing, it's
parents
interesting
after
you should, no, it's interesting you should mention Gissing because he actually underpins a lot of Orwell's political thought.
Yeah.
Now, by the way, for those of you out there thinking, what are they talking about?
Yeah, sorry.
George Gissing, one of the greatest English novelists of the 19th century. Anybody out there read George Gissing?
New Grub Street, anyone?
You are missing such a treat, ladies and gentlemen. Get out. Anyway, so Gissing again was he wrote all these terribly gloomy books about people. The one, New Grub Street, is the one about struggling writers, and it's just awful because people die and don't fulfil their ambitions. But one of the reasons Gissing was important to Orwell was because Gissing tried to make a study of the working classes in an optimistic way and wrote a novel called Workers in the Dawn, whose title says it all about what he thought about the prospect of social equality. And then completely gave up. Thought the working classes were just scum who festered in their hellholes in the East End of London. And what Orwell got from Gissing was that if social revolution is in the air, Gissing and Orwell, I think, thought that one of the prime movers towards an authoritarian society will be middle-class people who are frightened of their social position going. And I think that was a very, very shrewd stroke, that. So that's why Gissing is important to Orwell.
We need to talk about the elephant in the room, which is 1984, written in 1949, bestseller, New York Times, 2016-17, again 2021. You said what people want to know about him is what's he like. I think we want to know, why do we respond so strongly to him? Could you say what you think Orwellian means and whether people misunderstand what it means?
Orwellian means virtually anything. It's what a literature professor would call a floating signifier. It can mean whatever the hell you want it to mean, in just the same way that in Britain now, the adjective Dickensian just means sort of old and vaguely wrong. So anything can be Dickensian, So Orwellian, my definition of Orwellian would be an authoritarian society based on an obtrusive surveillance culture and involving a disregard for a total disregard for objective truth. But the thing about 1984 that I think readers find so extraordinary, and the statistic I always quote is that the Amazon sales of 1984 went up 950% in the week of Trump's inauguration in 2017. Was there a correlation? I don't know, but that's what happened. And the thing about that novel, Orwell never said that he was a prophet. He described 1984 as a warning. That was his description, a warning. And yet, Peter Davison, the renowned Orwell, in fact, Aaron was talking about the 4-volume collected Orwell. In fact, Peter Davison then did a 20-volume collected Orwell in the 1990s. And in fact, the book is dedicated to him and he died last year, as well as to Richard Blair, who put me in possession of those letters. But Peter Davison once sat down and wrote down a list of all the things that he thought Orwell had got right in 1984, and it was absolutely extraordinary because not only had he got the contending autocracies, not only had he got what we'll call the kind of nuclear standoff between these contending forces. Not only had he got surveillance technology, he got things like deforestation. He got things like in Britain, he got the national lottery. He got the submersion of the proletarian classes in pornography, and this kind. So wherever you looked in the world, you go in the arrangements of the model, you could find something that Orwell had kind of sort of put his finger on, or that the novel foreshadowed. And it's a much more subtle book than Orwell just looking at the two, the great autocracies of the 1940s, Nazi Germany followed by Soviet Russia, because he's kind of projecting it as well. He's trying to work out what the logical consequences are of these societies, rather than simply writing them up and satirizing them in a novel. So that, I think, was his great achievement. And the other thing too is, of course, that he created. It takes a very special writer to kind of open up a pipeline into the minds of people who've never read his books. But I mean, Dickens did it. Orwell did it with phrases like Big Brother and
You mentioned that, absorbed into the culture.
Room 101.
Dickens and Room
Room
101.
101. I mean, I don't know if you have it here in the States. In England, there's a terrible program called Room 101 where people celebrities go in and confess their pet sort of fears and hates, and someone will sit there and say, "Oh, I don't like mice, and they're very scary." And you think, Room 101? And that's where Winston Smith was tortured with a cage full of live rats. These are all very trivial.
Old ones with the furs that's brown. Yeah.
Oh, another thing too that I go to town on in this biography is Orwell's rat obsession. Oh dear me, yes. And
I'm more obsessed with him choosing always these woods, the golden country, where he can take a pretty girl for a stroll and then see her naked body. I mean, it's popping up everywhere. And now I'm seeing all the 2 Minutes Hate pops up before it gets to 1984. It's in Coming Up for Air. I mean, it's just kind of exciting.
So actually, are the pigs in Animal Farm? I only discovered this recently, that the great sort of symbolic climacteric of Animal Farm is when the oppressed animals walk up and look through the window of the room where the pigs are entertaining the farmers from the other farms, and look from pig to man and man to pig and can't tell the difference. But there's a scene at the end, towards the end of Coming Up for Air, where George Barling, the hero, is walking through the town of Henley in the Thames Valley, and sees what he thinks is a herd of pigs coming down the hill towards him, and their children wearing gas masks, which is extraordinarily impressive. 6 years before that Animal Farm, but he'd obviously got that idea in his head then.
It's just funny. I started teaching in 2017, right after the election, a class called Facts, Alternative Facts. And it's because I was so shocked. I thought of 1984 when I heard Kellyanne Conway say, they're alternative facts. I was like, that's how you get autocracy and totalitarianism. I was just terrified. But so I had the students read 1984, part of it, for one class. And they were competing on a terrifying buzzer system to beat each other by tagging things that were in the book and in their lives.
In some ways, I think the epigram of this that really gets me is from Animal, is there's the end of Animal Farm, where all the animals' commandments are reduced to all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others.
Yeah.
Do you think we ought to have some questions from the...
We should have some
open
from
this
the
up a
audience.
bit?
Yes, absolutely. We can't see their faces. Can someone help us? You guys are a glowing
I
blur.
can see you. Well, that's better. Do you like to be able to see the faces out there? Would anybody like to ask anything? We've got a roving mic. It's coming.
You with the glasses?
Actually, you have the roving mic, so maybe you can share one back and forth, and I'll put my hand through. Thank you, that's amazing. Who have we got here? Okay, right.
So what do you think Orwell would think of the new rise of fascism across the world?
The new rise of...
Fascism.
I think there's always an argument about what Orwell is actually satirising in 1984. Just as he died, he already knew that it would be weaponised by the CIA, which it was. The first film of 1984 was funded by the CIA in 1956. And yet, I was very, very fortunate because my wife, who's here, when she worked in publishing, she was the English editor for Sidney Sheldon. And as a very young screenwriter in 1949, Sheldon wanted to put 1984 on Broadway. And there is an exchange of letters, and he was, this was about 19, and Sidney Sheldon was able to give me his side of the story. And he had said to Orwell, I don't think this is as an attack, so much an attack on Soviet Russia as an attack on totalitarianism generally, i.e. fascism and communism. And Orwell said, absolutely right, and it's a shame other people haven't seen that too. So I think he would have been alarmed by that, but he would have seen it as part of a wider totalitarian thing rather than simply a fascist thing. And in fact, Orwell's, in some way, I suppose what I really think about this is that however hostile Orwell was to our Nazi Germany, his political consciousness was forged in the crucible of Spain in 1937. And the thing about the Spanish Civil War, if you were fighting on the left, as Orwell did, is that your enemy were the Spanish fascists, but you had another enemy, which was your fellow left-wingers who happened to be being supported by the Soviet Union. So I think by the time he got out of Spain, Orwell was more alarmed by the excesses of the Soviet agents who'd been after him in revolutionary Barcelona than perhaps with Franco, despite the fact that he got shot through the throat by a fascist sniper in 1937. So I do think that kind of sort of in some ways skewed his political thinking. Yeah. There's a gentleman behind there who's got the...
Hi, I've read 1984 many times, and only recently on a recent reading did it occur to me that the character of Julia might have been a setup from the get-go because they found Winston Smith suspicious. What are your thoughts about that?
That is exactly my theory, yes. I'll be very interested I'm coming tomorrow to hear about the Julia the novel that Sandra Newman will be talking about with avid interest, but I've always thought that the whole thing, that Julia is the honey trap. And that Winston Smith has been pulled out of the, rather like a stray steer, has been pulled out of the herd by a timber wolf, and she's the timber wolf acting on, because we know so little about her. We know that she's been involved with party officials. And also, another thing that leads me to think this is I had to write an introduction recently to the manuscript of 1984, of which only about 40% still exist. And there's a very interesting cancelled passage in that where Winston is leaving O'Brien's flat just after Julia has gone, and she comes running up to him. And although it's only just to fix another assignation, Winston thinks in the cancelled passage that it has this odd feeling that she's seen her for the last time. And Orwell cut that out of the finished version because it gave too much away. But yes, I think the whole thing is a setup from beginning to end.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. I have a concert tomorrow night based on some of the issues around Emmanuel Goldstein's banned novel, the Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. And one of the fun parts about the book, it's obviously very bleak, but the DNA of it led to, one could argue, people like William Gibson, Samuel Delany, various very renowned science fiction novelists. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the issues around colonialism, because obviously his relationship to Burma and his sort of seeing the brutality of the situation with the racial politics and colonialism at that time shaped some of his worldview. Obviously, Oceania has no capital. There's the racial politics in his novel have been kind of dispersed in a certain way. So I just would love to hear your thoughts.
That's a very interesting question, and thank you. Orwell was obviously mentally scarred by his experience of serving as a colonial policeman in the Empire in the late 1920s, although I don't think it was immediate. I think it took some years for this to work out. He didn't just come back from Burma and say, I hate all this, I'm going to be a writer. It was a much more complex thing. But as I understand it, his sympathy for the oppressed, the people he had to oppress in Burma, on the one hand was double-edged, because there were times when he felt, as he said, like sticking a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts. And he was, he was honest enough to acknowledge that. But this then produced a kind of displacement, and that he thought that by going amongst the British working classes, going out on the tramp with the bums and the hobos, he was actually going native in his own country. So he was going to the kind of outcast people who were the British equivalent of those natives in the Far East. He was also very honest about what he thought were British left-wing hypocrisy about the empire. There's a famous essay, I can't pronounce the full title because I get cancelled, but it's called Not Counting N-Words. And his theory there is that the left has to own up to the fact that the West's prosperity is based on oppressed natives in the East. And so if you're really serious about racial equality, which Orwell was, I think, you have to acknowledge that living standards in the West are going to have to fall, which was something that no left-wing political movement, certainly in Britain, ever wanted to contemplate in the 1940s. So I think that's the kind of progression that I would deduce out of his works there. Yes.
Anyone else? I think we have time for one more question.
One more?
Okay, I think we're done. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Let's have very much to see you again Sunday morning. Richard Brown.